पंजाबी प्रेस क्लब ऑफ कैनेडा के बारे असी गलबात करने जो कि संस्था है। संस्था का यही मतलब है कि असी अपने जर्नलिस्ट जोड़ा भाईचारा है, भावें रेडियो तो उन्होंने ताल्लुक हो, टीवी तो हो या अखबार तो हो, एक प्लेटफॉर्म पर मिल के समस्या जड़ियाँ डिफरेंट ने उन्होंने बारे सोचन तो उन्होंने हल कढ़न की कोशिश करन। इस सिलसिले के पिछले प्रोग्राम भी तुहानूं दिखाया सी कि असी एक मीट एंड ग्रीट की मैंबर पार्लीमेंट ब्रैम्पटन वैस्ट MP कायल सीबैक दे नाल। तुहानूं इस प्रोग्राम भी कुछ उहदियां झलकियां दिखावांगे। I hope you learn something from this segment as we do and you enjoy it as well.
A little bit more about, I think, for human rights. Just last week, 39-year-old person went to Grenada from Toronto. He was a permanent resident, and his name, I think, Oscar Baltman. And he was beaten by police in Grenada, and after that, he died, right? That's also human rights violation. And news came in Canadian media and government says something about that. Then the 5 policemen got charged, and even Prime Minister of that country and Police Commission have came out and spoke against that. Similar thing happened in India, in Pakistan, or anywhere else. And police brutality is every day going on issues. Some people come here, they are tortured, the Sikh, they are tortured, the Muslim or Christian, because if you speak like for even self-determination or for human rights there, even human rights activists are killed there, right? What are the stand for Canadian government, just because India is the bigger, largest democratic country in the world and have a good trade relation, not to make that relation bad? Sometimes they don't speak. What is? Well, I want to know that too.
I think it's a terrible tragedy what happened to that gentleman in Grenada, and I feel absolutely terrible for his family, and obviously express my deep condolences for them. The government of Grenada, I mean, the police officers there have been charged, and they're going to go through their judicial process, and we should respect that, and certainly until we see what the result of that process is going to be. There's going to be cases where people are, perhaps injured or killed all over the world. I don't know of a specific example that you're talking about in India or Pakistan, but anytime somebody suffers at the hands of a state, we should be very concerned, and it's an issue that we should raise. Absolutely. So I don't think it's unique to this gentleman going to Grenada, but if a Canadian citizen traveled to India and was picked up by the police and beaten to death, absolutely, I think we're going to have a comment on that and say that's...
There's one person, he's Canadian citizen, his name is Gail, I think. He's in police custody right now, right? And I think they came to see you or somebody else too. Maybe in future they will come to see you, or any member of parliament in Brampton or anywhere.
Sure.
Thank you for that.
No, look, we're always happy to help. If there's citizens who are in trouble, obviously foreign affairs should be the lead on that. But if you know of any cases where somebody is being detained in a foreign country and they need help, please bring it to me, and I'll make sure that it gets dealt with by foreign affairs.
One of my passions, and we have discussed it before also, and you are a part of that because you have that portfolio, is Aboriginal issues. What is your standpoint and your government standpoint? Because it's been a mumbo-jumbo of affairs, and I can't blame one single regime or one single party for that, but definitely it's been a disgrace all the way along. What improvements do you see, or how things can change? And obviously I'm talking about change for a better.
I think that, you said my portfolio. It's not actually my portfolio. I'm not the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs. I sit on the Standing Committee on Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development. So, we certainly, we undertake to study certain issues. One of the things we'll be looking at studying coming forward is going to deal with Aboriginal land management. So I'll tell you what I've learned. I actually asked if I could be on the Aboriginal Affairs Committee because I've never understood, why we have, some Native Canadians who are exceptionally successful. We have certain reserves that are an economic powerhouse. They're doing exceptionally well. And then, of course, we have examples such as Attawapiskat, where people are doing exceptionally poorly. And what is the difference? Why is that happening? What I can tell you is, from my limited experience, is that the problem is incredibly complex. We have the Indian Act, which is a very old piece of legislation. I think the last time it was modified in any significant sense was in the 1950s. So if you can, imagine perhaps if we'd never amended the criminal code in 50 years or 60 years, some people might say, boy, maybe that's not necessarily up to date. That being said, there are some great programs that exist to, help Aboriginal communities become economically successful. And land management, from what I've learned, is the way to do it. So if there's a couple of programs that Aboriginal communities can go through, one of which is called the First Nations Land Management Regime. So what most people perhaps don't know is that reserve land, in order for a native community to try and make improvements to reserve land or enter into leases or any sort of commercial opportunities to try and develop their land, they go through a very complex system under the Indian Act that makes it very complicated and a long process to try and deal with that. But if a native community goes through, for example, the First Nations Land Management Regime, if they complete that process, which is it's a government agency that goes through and helps them through that process. If they complete that process, they have the ability, their land gets removed from the constraints of the Indian Act, and it becomes much more easy for them to enter into leases and commercial opportunities. So I think that's a great way forward for a lot of our First Nations communities. The issues with poverty are very concerning. The challenge, of course, I think we find is, for example, at Attawapiskat, we've talked about it, that the federal government has invested $90 million over the last number of years. And we're not convinced that we're necessarily seeing value for that money, or as much value as we should. So, a couple things. We've introduced the First Nations, the Financial Transparency Act, which is going to, the legislation talks about audited financial statements for all monies that native bands receive. I think that's going to be helpful. But we really have to work together to try and find the solutions. It's just not. It's not acceptable that we have people living in such abject poverty. I know we've taken emergency measures to help in Attawapiskat to make sure that they're going to be able to have the water and housing to get through the winter. But long term, I don't think those are the solutions. We have to find the ways to make sure that we have some economic success on our reserve lands, and that there's good accountability for the money that the federal and provincial governments spend.
So the funding is just not the way they're managing it?
I'm not going to say that because I don't know. I haven't looked at their financial statements. But what I am saying is $90 million is a lot of money. And that doesn't include money that the provincial government may be spending. And it certainly doesn't include some of the resource revenue that they get from in Attawapiskat, for example. I think they have a large De Boers diamond mine that pays them a certain amount of revenue as well. So I would think that the outcomes would be better, but again, I'm not an expert. I haven't seen their financial statements. I don't know where the money's going. That's why we brought in third-party management to be able to make sure that the money that is being allocated there is being spent properly.
It was good for the taxpayers too. Giving money is a good thing, but then you got to know how to manage it too. If they're not managing it properly, they got to be audited.
Absolutely.
I think whenever people raise question for human rights and they ask Canadian government, look at your backyard. They also have that concern too, I think, right?
It is true, but the thing is, if this were a simple problem, then it would have been solved by now. I mean, we have had successive conservative and liberal governments that have been trying to fix this problem, and it's fixed in some areas. I mean, I want to be very clear. We have some very successful First Nations communities. They are economically successful, their people are prosperous, they have companies that are doing well, and then we have other communities that are doing very poorly. And what we have to do is try and get everybody to the economically successful position. And I know that that's one of our goals, and that's why we're trying to study ways at the committee to improve the land management regime so that we can unleash the economic potential on reserve.
Yeah, how is all this is all very nice and well, but the teen suicide rate up there is 1 in 3. And I know this for a fact because I have a family member that flies into remote communities. Attawapiskat is just the tip of the iceberg. If these kids are killing themselves, what future is going to be for anybody? If there's no youth coming up, there is no future. There is no education. There is no hope. There is no, they live in absolute hopelessness. What are they going to do about the teen suicides? How are they going to try to help stem the tide?
I don't know that, and you know, you may have better statistics than I do, but I've never heard that the teen suicide rate is 1 in 3 on Aboriginal reserve.
The attempted rates in the Moosonee, Hudson Bay area is 1 in 3. And
okay.
It is documented.
Look, that's terrible. That's an absolute tragedy. I mean, one suicide's a tragedy, and something that we should all be very concerned with. But again, I go back to, I think, the abject poverty of certain communities is the reason why teens see that they have no hope. They see that their parents are economically disadvantaged and don't have any future, and therefore they don't see that they have a future. So in my mind, the answer is twofold. Number one, we need better economic opportunities for our Native Canadians on reserve, because we all know that, you know, for us to feel like we're doing well, we have a job, we're able to buy a house or build a house, and we have the ability to be economically successful. I think that's very important on our reserve lands. Number two, you know, we spend, and this is not an exact figure, but what I can tell you is this, we spend approximately $12 billion a year on Aboriginal affairs. Now that is an enormous amount of money, and we're still seeing an enormous amount of poverty and distress in our First Nations communities. So I think the First Nations Financial Transparency Act is going to be very helpful, because, you know, look, we're going to see one of two things, or maybe a combination of it. We're going to see that we're getting great value for our money, and that perhaps we've got a funding issue. Or maybe we're going to see that our money is being very poorly spent, and we need to look at ways to fix that. But, you know, I think those two things together are going to be a great step forward.